All right. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Glad you could be here for part 2 of our investigation of the Haggadah. And if you missed the first class, don't worry. This is not a consecutive type of class where one builds on the other. And if you missed the previous class, you won't understand what's going on because we're dealing with different sections of the Haggadah separately, so it should be fine. And plus, I have posted on the Adler YouTube page the first part of the class. So if you ever want to go back and watch last week's class, you can do that, and I'll post this week's class and next week, so it'll all be up there for everyone to view. Let's jump back into the Haggadah. If you recall, last week we looked at kind of the question of the 4 questions and what does that mean, and we also looked at the question of how to introduce the story, and I want to go back to that. We'll talk about that a little bit more in depth, in the sense of the Haggadah is all about telling the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt, and the rabbis have a particular arc that they want this story to go in. And so let me share the screen with the text. So we have here the text from the Talmud. This is from Psachim 116a. So the Babylonian Talmud, which was written around the 7th century or so. It's a little unclear when exactly. We don't have an edit date, of course. This is an ancient text, so at least 13, maybe 1400 years old. It was edited in Babylonia. That is what was modern day Iraq, in probably the 7th century, early 7th century, because we know it really doesn't mention the Muslim invasion of Babylonia, which happened around that time. And so we're fairly confident that it's before, it was edited before that time, but it could have been even before that, earlier. And so it was written in a Persian context. The Persians were in charge of Iraq around that time. So this text here is from the section of the Talmud that deals with Passover. And it gives us an instruction on how we're supposed to tell this story. And it picks up where the Mishnah leaves off. So the Mishnah had said that we begin the story with disgrace and we conclude with glory. That was in the Mishnah, which we looked at last week. So you should tell the story on the Seder night and begin with disgrace and conclude with glory. The problem with the Mishnah is it doesn't really tell us what that means. What should be the disgrace that we begin with, and what should be the glory? So the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of this term, with disgrace? So Rab said that one should begin by saying, at first our forefathers were idol worshippers, before concluding with words of glory. And Shmuel, maybe, I have Shmuel in brackets here, we'll see later it may not have been Shmuel, said the disgrace which with one should begin is the answer, his answer is, we were slaves. So we have 2 possibilities for beginning this story and starting with disgrace. So one possibility is what Rav says, which is, at first our forefathers were idol worshippers. So the disgrace is our ancestors worshipped idols, which is pretty bad. And the second possibility is that we were slaves, that slavery was the disgrace that should begin our story. So first, I want to ask all of you, do you have a preference for which way to start the story on the Seder night? What do you think? Which one is better?
Why not both?
Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Why not both?
Well, as I think I mentioned last week, that the rabbis very often, if they have a choice between two things, will include both. So you can include both, although one of them has to be the beginning, because you can't have two beginnings, right? And this is something that I talked about last week. I showed a little bit of a clip or an interview about Godfather Part 3, which was re-edited to be Godfather Coda by the director, this guy right here, Francis Ford Coppola, because he didn't like the way he began it the first time. And so he decided to re-edit it and put in a new beginning. So I guess you could edit the movie in two different ways and show the two different ways. But our Haggadah is a book, and so it's written in an order, and so you've got to start with one. Now you can put both in, and that's ultimately how the Haggadah was created. That they didn't choose; they just put in both. So Lynn, what do you have a thought? Which one's better?
Well, doesn't the Seder book start with "We were slaves in Egypt"? That's like the first sentence. So somewhere along the line, somebody put that in.
Yeah,
we were slaves in Egypt.
Well, we put both of them in, but yes, the Avadim Hayinu is the first one. So it's almost as if we have two introductions to the story in our Haggadah. But the first one that is chosen is you're correct, is Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves.
But don't we want to let them know? Don't we want to start a story? We were slaves in Egypt, and then we were saved, and so therefore the story has to go on from there.
Well, that's one choice. So that's this second option here, which I'll give you a hint that it actually probably wasn't Shmuel, but it was another one of the rabbis who said, yeah, we should start with we were slaves. But Rav doesn't want to start. Rav says we should start with first we were idol worshippers, which is chronologically first. That came before we were slaves.
Yeah, but does that?
But we didn't choose to be slaves, and we did choose to be idol worshippers.
Right. So which one is more of a disgrace?
I would assume an idol worshiper, because if you didn't choose and you were forced to be a slave, that's not a disgrace.
Yeah, so it's a good point. We were enslaved. It wasn't our choice. It certainly is a disgraceful position to be in, but it's not a disgrace to the slave to be a slave. You have no choice to be a slave, but you do, as Phil said, you do have a choice to worship idols. So you could argue that idol worship is more of a disgrace than being a slave, because it's something that was chosen. So if you were Francis Coppola, how would you edit the Haggadah that started out with we were slaves, or started out with we were idol worshippers?
Go back and show that we were bad people and we worshipped idols, and then we were punished and became slaves because that was God's way of punishing us, to become slaves. I don't know. There's no right or wrong answer, Well, if Francis Ford Coppola, who looks like he lost a lot of weight, is he well, or did he get? That's the one thing that stuck with me with that. But if you want to go back, are we being punished? If you want to do the analogy, do bad things happen to the mafia because of the Godfather, or what? Do we get punished, become slaves Was that our punishment? Now we're going to be captured and become slaves because we worship idols?
That's a good question. Erwin, what is your thought?
Well, I just wanted to hark back to your saying that you can't have two beginnings. Actually, there's precedent for that. If you go to Bereshit, the creation is described twice, not quite the same way.
That's right.
So,
You're
so
right.
we very much have two beginnings.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I hadn't thought about that, but yes, the story of creation in Genesis, in the book of Bereshit, is told in two different ways that we sometimes try to harmonize, but they're actually quite different stories. So one is this global cosmic story of how the world was created in 7 days or 6 days, and then God rested. And then in the next chapter, we have a more human sort of fable and fairy tale and story where human beings are created, and when you try and like square the details, they don't necessarily work out together. And so it is almost like we have two different beginnings to the Torah. So there's good precedent for trying to start the story in two different ways. But I think sometimes it gets lost that these are two separate ways of beginning the story. Lynn did a nice job there of harmonizing the stories, to say, well, start out with we were slaves, and then the punishment was that we went, start out with we were idol worshippers, and then the punishment was that we went down to Egypt. And so therefore you can kind of combine the two. But in the Talmud, they're not offered as two different complementary stories. They're really offered as two separate stories.
I think that the emphasis really should be on the we were slaves. To say our forefathers were idol worshippers certainly is fact, but that's at a period where I shouldn't be as bold to say everyone was an idol worshiper, but that was before Judaism began.
Right.
We weren't Jews as idol worshippers. We were Jews as slaves.
Right. So, Phyllis had said, one is slavery is not our fault, but worshiping idols is our fault. But you're offering another possibility. Maybe worshiping idols is not our fault either. That's just the way of the world. This was before God, revealed God's self to Abraham, and so we didn't know how to do better. So I think these are really interesting things for us to think about. And I had said last week that I wanted us to look at the Haggadah with kind of fresh eyes and a little bit of a lack of familiarity, because sometimes it becomes too familiar a text and we ignore these little interesting questions that we may not have thought of if we look at it as this more of an alien kind of text. So we have these two possibilities of how we can start the story, and could think of it like a movie here. But if we look at actually what the Haggadah says, let's see what the Haggadah does with these two possibilities. So let me see if I can make it a little bit bigger so it's easier to read. Would somebody like to read here the Passover, the Haggadah? This is how the we were slaves portion comes into the Haggadah. Would somebody like to read?
We were slaves to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt, and the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched forearm. And if the Holy One, blessed be he, had not taken our ancestors from Egypt, behold, we and our children's children would all be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. And even if we were all sages, all discerning, all elders, all knowledgeable about the Torah, it would be a commandment upon us to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And anyone who adds and spends extra time in telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt, behold, he is praiseworthy.
Thank you. So this is the way the story is presented in the Haggadah. So we should note that we uncover the matzah when we say this, and we put the Seder plate back on the table, because we removed the Seder plate from the table to prompt the questioning from the children, which had come right before this. Then we put the Seder plate back on and uncover the matzah, because the matzah is the symbol of this story of redemption. So we were slaves, and then God took us out from there. And we have this addition here, which was added later. This idea, this is not from Shmuel or whoever the rabbi who says that we should start with being slaves in Egypt. We have this addition here that was added. What do you think about that addition? Does it add good context here? What do you think? So the Haggadah does say, if God hadn't taken us from out of Egypt, we still would have been there. It's a good point, and I think it connects to the idea that in the Haggadah we were given this commandment, and it really comes from the Mishnah, that we were supposed to see that we ourselves were brought out of Egypt, that we were saved, not just our ancestors that were saved, but we ourselves were saved. And this really drives home that point. If the Holy One, blessed be He, had not taken our ancestors out of Egypt, we and our children's children would all be enslaved to Pharaoh. We still would be there. So it's really trying to get us to think and put ourselves into the story. And this is one way of thinking about it. It's not that we have to transport ourselves back in time to put ourselves in Egypt. We can actually fast forward the story of our slavery in Egypt, wind the story to our time, and say that if this hadn't happened, if the Exodus hadn't happened, we still would be there. It's sort of like an alternative history. And actually, I just got a Haggadah. It's fairly new. It's only the last 2 years, that I think does a good job of showing that. So I'll stop my screen share now and show you this, the Passover Haggadah graphic novel.
Cool.
So it actually is a real Haggadah. It's got the full Haggadah text, but it's as a graphic novel. And the text of the Haggadah, the parts where you're actually telling the story, are told in a graphic novel form. And so they do something, they make really interesting choices. So the text that's in the bubbles of the graphic novel is just the Haggadah text. They don't change anything. They just give you exactly the English translation of the Haggadah, but it's the artwork that makes the interesting artistic choices. So on this passage, they have a really interesting choice. So hopefully you'll be able to see it if I hold it up to the camera. They make lots of really interesting choices, by the way, but this one I found particularly kind of powerful. So here it is. This is the page where it says, if the Holy One had not rescued us from Egypt, we, our children, and our children's grandchildren, our grandchildren would still be enslaved to the Egyptian Pharaoh. And so for the last panel, I don't know if you can see, they are here you see people in cubicles as slaves to Pharaoh. So it's a modern take on what would slavery be like? Well, slavery today, if we were still slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, would be being at a call center and answering calls, with the taskmaster being, the boss up there. So I thought that's just like a really cool way of showing that text, and it really brings home the idea that we were freed in a sense in Egypt. It's not an act of imagination to put us back into that time. It's actually that we wouldn't be where we are today if it weren't for the deeds that were done for our ancestors. So the Haggadah really contextualizes this idea that we were slaves in Egypt. But that's only one of the beginnings. So as I mentioned, there are two beginnings. So the next beginning is we were idol worshipers at the beginning. Our fathers were idol worshipers. So this comes in later, after the four sons, which we'll get to in a second, or in a few minutes. We'll talk about the four sons or the four children. But this comes later, this different beginning, which is that our ancestors were idol worshipers. So would somebody like to read this in the English? Can I get a volunteer? Yeah, thank you, Elaine.
From the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers, and now the place of awe has brought us close to his worship, as it is stated. Yeshua said to the whole people, "So said the Lord, God of Israel, over the river did your ancestors dwell from always. Terach, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they worshipped other gods. And I took your father Abraham from over the river, and I made him walk in all the land of Canaan, and I increased his seed and gave him Yitzhak. And I gave to Yitzhak Yaakov and Esau, and I gave to Esau Mount Seir in order that he inherit it. And Yaakov and his sons went down to Egypt. Blessed be the one who keeps his promise to Israel. Blessed be he. Since the Holy One, blessed be he, calculated the end of the exile to do as he said to Abraham, our father, in the covenant between the pieces as it is stated. And he said to Abraham, you should surely know that your seed will be a stranger in the land that is not theirs, and they will enslave them and afflict them for 400 years. And also that nation for which they shall toil will I judge, and afterwards they will go out with much property. He covers the matzah and lifts the cup and says, and it is this that has stood for our ancestors and for us, since it is not only one person or nation that has stood against us to destroy us, but rather in each generation they stand against us to destroy us. But the Holy One, blessed be he, rescues us from their hand.
Thank you.
Wow.
There's a lot to read there. I appreciate
No, it's interesting. It's a lot of information.
It is.
Yeah.
It is a lot of information. And it's a bit of a different perspective from the perspective before, when it was about our slaves in our position as slaves in Egypt. So what's the emphasis on here in this section? Yeah, Lynn.
Well, that in generations to come, you might not know the people that are going to go from you, but your seed, your procreation is going to create the next population. So whatever covenant you make now is going to get carried on by people that you won't even know about because you'll be long gone. I mean, that's what I think it says.
Yeah.
And the judgment will be, they're going to judge you now, but if your seed, if your procreationists, your generations follow your teachings, then they will continue your beliefs, maybe, hopefully.
Yeah. So
I find something very interesting.
Yeah.
Jacob was sent down to Israel to be a slave and his people for 400 years. And his brother, who he was cheated, was given an inheritance and not punished.
Right. Well, not punished at that time.
Well,
Yeah.
I know, but that's what it's saying at this particular point. He inherited it. He gave him Mansir, and in order that he inherited, and Yaakov and his sons went down to Egypt, and then it says he's going to be a slave for 400 years, he and his sons. So it's like a punishment.
Right. And there, so it's interesting here that this is a speech that's quoted from the book of Joshua, and it's actually Yoshua said to the whole people, this is a little historical summary that he gives. First, our ancestors lived on the other side of the river. They worshipped other gods. God took us, God took Abraham from there and brought him to the land of Israel. And then Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt. So, Esau is mentioned here, but it's not the main focus, but they do include it. You're right. So it does kind of raise interesting questions. Well, Esau was not punished there. Esau got to live in Seir, and things were fine, but it was Jacob who had to go down into Egypt. So why? But clearly they want to keep this whole passage because it leads from Rav's suggestion that we start with being idol worshipers, and within a matter of only 3 verses takes us from being idol worshipers all the way down to being in Egypt. And so we get back to that place of slavery. But I think it's interesting that the focus here is a little bit different than the focus on when you begin the story from Avadim Hayinu and the Haggadah, which kind of really highlights that idea that we still would be slaves if we hadn't been freed by God. Here now, it doesn't take the idea of being slaves and projects it into the future. It takes the idea of oppression and projects it out into the future, because we have this famous passage. I feel like a lot of the famous passages are ones that have songs attached to it. So Avadim Hayinu, we sing, if you, not everyone sings in their Seder, and people sing different songs, but a very popular song is to sing Avadim Hayinu, Hayinu.
Right, that's the song.
Right, so that's a common song to sing. In this section, this version of the beginning, we have a different song that is often sung, which you see here in the Hebrew. Vehi she'amna lavotenu velanu. So that's another song that's very often sung. And it's the translation of that is, and it's kind of an awkward translation. It's hard to translate. They translate it as, and it is this that has stood for our ancestors and for us. So Vehi she'amda, Vehi is she has stood, but what is the she? The she is the Havtacha, which is the promise. So the promise that God gave to Avram, that your seed will be a stranger in the land and will be enslaved, but they'll go out with property and they'll be freed. So this, of course, is foreshadowing because it comes from the book of Genesis. Before the Israelites were ever enslaved, God says to Abraham, he's not even Abraham yet, he's just Abram. He says, well, you're going to go down into Egypt and then you're going to come out. But eventually your ancestors, your descendants are going to go down. They're going to be slaves, but they're going to be freed. So it's that promise of redemption, the promise that God will end the suffering that you have. And so the translation here is really, and this promise was good for our ancestors, but not just them. It also is good for us too, because we have always faced persecution and we continue to face persecution, but eventually God will rescue us from their hand. So this is a very popular thing to sing because it's this beautiful idea that I think resonates for us who know very well our history, that just because we were rescued from Egypt and brought to the land of Israel doesn't mean it was the end of the story, and it doesn't mean it was the end of our tsuras. You know, we've had people that have come to persecute us and to attack us, and this wasn't the last of that. So it really kind of flips the previous introduction, which was to say that, hey guys, you should remember that you could literally still be slaves right now if God hadn't freed us. Now, this introduction flips it a little bit and says, yeah, even though you were freed, doesn't mean that that was the end of suffering. It doesn't mean that was the end of slavery, as it were. And so we have always had people persecuting us. Just because Pharaoh lost doesn't mean that we didn't have the pogroms, and we didn't have the Crusades, and we didn't have Hitler, and et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, even though we were freed, we still had the effect of slavery over the years, and each time God has saved us. So I know we have a couple of people raise their hand, but I want to show you just this graphic novel Haggadah again, so you can see what they did with this text, which you can maybe imagine how they might have presented it. Where is it here?
All right.
So here is the text Vihi Sha'amda, and you can see that the text shows this person. He looks like he was. There's this kind of theme of Soviet Jewry. So it looks like he's in a work camp in the Soviet Union here. But even so, he sees other people who, you know, were the past people who rose up against the Jews. You know, so you've got a Roman soldier, looks like a crusader, you know, Nazi terrorist, and you can see, you know, eventually what happens, that he gets to Israel and, you know, is living a free life. So again, you know, taking the story and making it more, perhaps more real, and modernizing it. Erwin.
I'm looking at that, and it kind of strikes me as a endless cycle. It's nice to say, you know, in every generation, someone rose against us, but God saved us. Only until the next time. It almost makes me think of the line from Fiddler on the Roof, where Tevye goes, I know we're the chosen people, but for once could you have chosen someone else?
Right.
Is there ever an end point to this?
Yeah, it's right. You say, right. At some point, can God save us, and then that's enough. That's the end, right? We're saved. No more need for saving anymore. So in a sense, it's sort of a optimistic but also realistic passage, right? To say that, you know, we know that this is going to happen again, and each time we'll get through it. but we know that that process is never going to end. You know, there's always going to be someone else to come and want to oppress us. Lynn, did you have your hand up, or was that from?
Oh, that was from the other one.
Okay. I'll lower it for you there. All right, so let's go back then to the text. So this is the different. These are two different ideas. One is that we were slaves. One is we were idol worshipers for the disgrace. But it turns out it may not be that simple. So, as you may or may not know, there are actually two Talmuds. There is the Talmud of Babylonia, which we looked at the beginning of this class. But there is also the Talmud of the land of Israel, which is often called the Jerusalem Talmud, in Hebrew, the Yerushalmi. The Jerusalem Talmud was edited much earlier because the Jewish life in the land of Israel became much more precarious earlier. So it was edited probably in the 4th century. And then after that time, it was very difficult for the Jewish community there. There still were Jews living even after the 4th century in the land of Israel, but not as much flourishing of Jewish life as there was in Babylonia. And but these two different Talmuds mostly agree on things, but there's often significant disagreements, and it's very interesting to compare the two. And in the Middle Ages, after the editing of both Talmuds, there were some communities in the world that followed the Jerusalem Talmud because they really sort of had allegiance to the Jerusalem academies that used the Jerusalem Talmud. And then most of the Jewish world, however, followed the Babylonian Talmud, and the rabbis in what is modern day Iraq, who were interpreting and reading and following the Babylonian Talmud. So so today, the Babylonian Talmud is definitive and is our main source for Jewish law. The Jerusalem Talmud studied far less. So, like the Daf Yomi cycle that you might hear about of people studying one page of Talmud every day, they're studying the Babylonian Talmud. As far as I know, there's not a Daf Yomi for the Jerusalem Talmud. It's not studied as much. But it's very interesting to see what the Jerusalem Talmud says often. And so if you go and look at the Jerusalem Talmud on Psachim, the same section that we were looking at in the Babylonian Talmud, we have a similar statement from Rav to what we had before. So there in the Jerusalem Talmud, it says, Rav said, from the beginning, one needs to begin. Over the river did your ancestors dwell, but I took your father Abraham from beyond the Euphrates and multiplied. So there's a lot of ellipses here, some dots. But what is the difference between what Rav says here in the Jerusalem Talmud from what Rav says this is Psachim, here is the Babylonian Talmud. What's the difference between what Rav says in the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud? So here in the Babylonian Talmud, Rav said, one should begin by saying our forefathers were idol worshippers. What's the difference?
Is the idea that one sort of starts with a positive. The idea is like, you moved past this and we multiplied. And the other one is like, we started at the bottom. Like, it's sort of harping on a negative.
So which one is the one? So you're saying the Babylonian Talmud, it's harping on the negative? We were idol worshippers?
I mean, it's so hard to say negative, like pasts are just pasts, but it does feel a little less like, You know, it's like saying like things were rough instead of saying like, oh, I became very successful from nothing. It's like the way you phrase it, maybe.
Okay. That's definitely one way of looking at it.
I love it when you say that because it's such a nice way of saying thank you for chatting, but very wrong.
Not at all. Not at
love
all.
it, Rabbi.
Not at all. It's not what I was going for, but it's a different way of looking at it. So you're assuming though that with what you said though, that here in the Jerusalem Talmud, that Rav is not being negative. Now remember, Rav is answering this question of the idea that we should begin with disgrace. So you could interpret that to mean that he thinks that this is a disgrace. Now you, Amanda Rena, might think, oh, that's not as bad as our forefathers were idol worshippers. But he might think it's bad. But what's the main difference here with the Rav in the Jerusalem Talmud versus Rav in the Babylonian Talmud? What's missing in the Jerusalem Talmud?
The idols.
Yeah, the idols. Rav does not say that in the beginning our ancestors were idol worshippers in the Jerusalem Talmud. He just says that our ancestors lived across the river. It's only in the Babylonian Talmud that Rav says that our ancestors were idol worshippers. Now,
Rabbi?
Yeah.
In the Jerusalem Talmud, it is strictly a geographic connotation. Is that the rabbi's way of indicating that, originally our ancestors came from a bad part of town and they moved to be better?
Yeah, well, what is the bad part of town?
The other side of the river. Is that the implication?
Yeah, but specifically, like, what would we, I mean, what is beyond the river? Like, which river are we talking about here?
Euphrates.
Yeah. But so what would be within the river, or on this side of the river? Remember, it's Joshua here talking. So it's the land of Israel, because Joshua was leading the Israelites to the promised land. And when he says on the other side of the river, he means over there. Like literally, Joshua was talking to the Israelites as they are crossing actually after they've crossed the Jordan River and have come into the land of Israel. And he's saying, your ancestors lived on the other side, remember? And then they came here. So the bad part of town was everything that's not Eretz Israel, everything that's not the land of Israel. Eventually, God brought them here. God brought Abraham, etc. Then we went down to Egypt. Now we're back. We're back in the good part of town.
So when the rabbis were debating what particular disgrace to begin the story in the Haggadah, it's really incremental bad things. It's our ancestors were idolaters, then they weren't in Israel, then they were slaves. Pick one.
Right. No, and you're right. So yeah, and you point to the fact that there really are 3 disgraces. So at first we thought there were only 2. One was we were idol worshippers, and one was we were slaves. But now actually,
they'll find another.
Right. We can always find more. Give me a little while. I can find plenty of negative things, right? But here we've got a third, which is in the beginning, we didn't live in the land of Israel. We were diaspora people. We were outside the land. And that's the third possibility here, which gets transformed in the Babylonian Talmud and then also into our Haggadah. So as I said, the Jerusalem Talmud is not the definitive and not the authoritative Talmud of the two. But it seems that in the Jerusalem Talmud, that Rob's problem was, Rob's notion of disgrace was living outside the land of Israel. Now, the question of these ellipses is always important, which, I just copied over from the Hebrew. The Hebrew just has this word vigomer, which means etc. So very often in the Talmud, when there's an ellipses, a missing piece of a verse, you're meant to fill it in. They understood that people would know the verses. You just start the verse, and then the person would be able to end it themselves, and they would know what the rest of the verse is. But maybe there are some times where they deliberately leave out parts of the verse for emphasis. And I think, you can make an argument here that the different pieces are left out on purpose because he wasn't focused on the part that's the 3 dots. So his focus is, in the beginning, our ancestors lived outside the land of Israel. What's important, though, is that Abraham was brought by God to this land, and that God multiplied his descendants, his seed, and they became numerous. That's what's really important for him. So if we go up here and see what was missing, you can see here, I kept in the orange what is included in the Jerusalem Talmud, but this passage also fills in what was left out. So the Jerusalem Talmud includes, over the river did your ancestors dwell from always, Terach, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they worshipped other gods. So this is the part about worshiping other gods, but was left out. And then I took him and brought him to the land of Canaan. I increased the seed, etc. So it is possible that the Jerusalem Talmud doesn't really care about idol worship and the fact that our ancestors were idol worshipers, but really cares that our ancestors lived outside the land of Israel. And it makes sense because this is the Jerusalem Talmud. This is the Talmud of the land of Israel. And if we think today there's a conflict between the Zionists and Israelis and diaspora Jews, I would argue we still had that conflict back in ancient times, in the time of the Talmud, when you had the Jerusalem Talmud arguing for living in the land of Israel, and the Babylonian Talmud saying, Israel's nice, but Babylonia is good too. You don't know, so the Babylonian Talmud wouldn't have would never have said that the disgrace was living outside the land of Israel, because they were living outside the land of Israel. So you couldn't say that, for them, they couldn't say that was the disgrace. And it's interesting that the Jerusalem Talmud does not include the other possibility of starting this with, we were slaves. It only says you should start with the fact that we lived across the river. It doesn't include this other idea that we were slaves. Amanda, you wanted to say something?
Yes, let me put my hand down. There you go. All right. Does it take any piece into account that where you live when you are a slave is of no choice to you? I suspect it wasn't like you can be in Jerusalem and just commute to Babylon, you nice slaves, whereas being an adulterer or, an idol worshiper is something somebody actively has to choose? Or was this written at a time where, like you're saying, they were just trying to, do a little slap in the face of the Babylonian Jews? Like when I was younger, we would never, but there are obviously still people doing it.
Well, I think that you bring up a really good point, and it's this question that we go back to, kind of debate between Phyllis and Lynn, right? That you don't have a choice. You're a slave by definition. You don't have any choice, but idol worship is something you choose. But maybe it's not something you choose. Maybe everybody was worshiping idols back then. There wasn't even a concept of worshiping God. So maybe it wasn't much of a choice. And now here we have this other question. Well, whether you live in the land of Israel or outside the land of Israel, maybe it wasn't as much of a, it's not always a choice. Yes, it is potentially a choice, but it's not always. And so I think in all these cases, we have this really interesting question of what does the disgrace mean? Is it something that we can control or something we can't control? That it's not a simple answer. I don't know if that kind of addressed your question or your comment.
It certainly addressed the question. It has created so many more questions, but we should move on. There's a lot of Haggadah to get through.
Right. No, but to me, it's really this fascinating idea that, what is disgrace? Is disgrace something that you can control, or it's something you can't control? And what can we actually control, and what can't we control? It's not quite clear.
Well, when it's something you can't control, it just starts to fall too much to the idea of like original sin, or,
Right.
The big fault of Jews was simply being born Jews, which I suspect would be God's choice and not ours, right? At one point or another. Like if that is the sin.
And, doesn't speak well of being Jewish, right? If that's the punishment, or that's the disgrace, is being Jewish, that's not, something.
But this would have been written by Jews, correct?
Right. Yeah.
This wasn't like Babylonian nice literature.
Right.
Like Babylonians were pumping slave songs into us, like
Right.
Go down yonder on the other side of the river. Like, why would one choose to write that? I don't understand. We can move on. I'm so sorry.
Wait, but be specific. Why would somebody choose to write what?
To write the idea that the problem was really just being born outside of Jerusalem. Like many of us, I was certainly born outside of Jerusalem. Like,
right.
That is not that's not something anybody can control.
Well, you can't control where you were born, but you can, as an adult, control where you live.
Sometimes.
Right? You can move to Israel.
I mean, in theory, we do know that like passports that's a government construct to control people.
Sure.
Like if you were born in North Korea, I'm certain you couldn't just move to Jerusalem.
Right. But today, most people can move. And even if you can't, even if you couldn't, let's say you're, this is 1980 and you're a Soviet Jew and you can't immigrate, it still perhaps would resonate, the idea of the disgraces that you're stuck where you are. It may not be your fault, but it still is a terrible situation to be in. And probably somebody, in Soviet Russia would very much resonate with that idea of, being stuck where they are and not able to do what Abraham was able to do. Yeah, Erwin.
That kind of comes back to what we were saying before about the unending cycle. This seems like the rabbis are saying it's better for us to all be together in our own little isolated community than living anywhere else because our neighbors will never get along with us.
Yeah.
The why can't we all be friends?
Right.
I think they're saying, no, that's not going to happen.
Right. Although we should point out though, in the time of the Jerusalem Talmud, there were lots and lots of non-Jews living in the land of Israel, and they weren't, the Jews didn't have self-determination. It wasn't a Jewish state. You were living under the Byzantine Empire or the late Roman Empire, and there wasn't a whole lot of necessarily freedom that we would understand. But at least you were living in the land of Israel, they might say. But I think it's really interesting and important to understand who these people were when we're trying to understand what they said. So if you go back and recall that in this section here in the Babylonian Talmud, it says Shmuel said that we should begin with "we were slaves." but I said that it probably wasn't Shmuel. And one of the nice things about our digitized world is that you can go back and look at the manuscripts of the Talmud and try and find the earliest good manuscripts that we have on this passage and see, well, actually, who was it who said this? Was it really Shmuel? So we should point out that Rav and Shmuel lived together. They were contemporaries, and throughout the Talmud, Rav and Shmuel are always fighting with each other, or I should say fighting. They're always disagreeing on matters of Jewish law. So Rav says this, Shmuel says this, and they knew each other. They were colleagues. These were probably real arguments that they had, and so that's probably why Shmuel is presented here as the contrary position. But the way it's presented is, well, Rav says one thing, Shmuel says another. They were probably arguing in the Beit Midrash about this, and Rav said, no, it's first we were idol worshippers, and Shmuel says, no, it's we were slaves. But actually, if you go and look in the manuscript, which I took out this passage in this manuscript from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and I'm just realizing I didn't put the time period that it's from. I believe it's from the 12th or 13th century, something like that. So it's like 800 or 900 years old, this manuscript. So it's a really old manuscript and probably reflects what the Talmud really said. And it's actually housed in the Jewish Theological Seminary, so you could go and look at it if you wanted to, but you can look at it online, actually. So here it says, Matchil bignud u'mesayem b'shevach. So you begin with disgrace and end with praise. My ganud, what is this disgrace? Rav Amar matchila, or mitchila, I should say. So Rav says we begin with, and the ... there is, we were slaves. That we were idol worshippers. Rava Amar Avadim Hayinu Lefaro v'Mitzrayim. Rava said we were slaves to Pharaoh. So it really shouldn't be Shmuel, it should be Rava. So now you say, well, what does that mean? Who cares? What does it mean that it should be Rava? So Rava was a sage who lived in Babylonia much later than Rav. They wouldn't have known each other. There's actually two possibilities of which there are two Ravas, of course, to make it easy for us. So there's one that lived pretty far after Rav and one that lived quite a bit farther after Rav. But either way, it wasn't somebody that Rav knew. And we should understand that they had lives and particular lived experiences which might reflect the difference in their position, and would actually tell us why one felt that the disgrace was one thing and one felt the disgrace was the other, and that they weren't arguing with each other. This is the Talmud imagining their argument. So let's read here. This is actually from Josh Culp, who put together this Haggadah, which I showed last time, the Schechter Haggadah, which has really good commentary by Dr. Josh Culp, who lives in Jerusalem and is an expert in Talmud. So would somebody like to read here where it says Rav? Anyone want to volunteer to read in this English here?
Rav may have interpreted disgrace as living outside of the land of Israel. The children of Israel were in a state of disgrace because thy went down to the land of Egypt. In contrast, Rava, a later Babylonian Amora, whose youth and education was completely in Babylonia, unlike Rav, who grew up in Eretz Israel and later moved to Babylonia, emphasizes that the disgrace begins after the Israelites have already reached Egypt when they were enslaved. Merely living in Egypt without being enslaved is not in and of itself disgraceful.
Okay, so just stop there. So and I realize I have a typo here when I was transcribing. I'll just fix that. So Rav actually was a Babylonian, but he moved to the land of Israel. And then he moved back to Babylonia. Rav grew up in land of Israel, but then eventually moved to Babylonia. Whereas Rava spent his whole life in Babylonia. Rav focused on living outside the land. That's what he cared about. That's what he felt was the disgrace. And you can just imagine him, this person who lived in the land of Israel, but eventually went to Babylonia, and perhaps later when he was in Babylonia regretted leaving the land of Israel. And so when he talks about the disgrace of was living in the land of Israel, you kind of feel his, you feel that personal history that he had, that he really was upset that he had left, and that, it was his own personal disgrace that he didn't live in the land. Whereas, for him, being slaves it's not in itself disgraceful. So Mike, why don't you continue? This is a later comment from Dr. Culp.
Whereas the
Yerushalmi
Jerusalem version may have emphasized the disgrace of living outside the land of Israel, and at the least did not specify the moral degradation of being idol worshippers, the Babylonian version of Rav places emphasis specifically on idolatry. The disgrace is that the Israelites were originally idol worshippers, a spiritual disgrace to which Babylonian Jews living in the midst of an idolatrous society could easily relate.
Thank you. So, what Dr. Culp is saying here is that, originally what Rav cared about was that living outside the land was a disgrace. But eventually, the Babylonian Talmud transformed what Rav had said to be not about living outside the land, but about worshiping idols, which was something that the Babylonians who were living in an idolatrous society could understand more as a disgrace. They wouldn't have looked at living outside the land itself as being a disgrace. So they transformed what Rav had originally said, which was living outside the land, to be about worshiping idols, which was something that they could relate to as a disgrace. So I just thought this is so relevant to us today, thinking about our relationship as Jews living here in America versus living in Israel, and how Israelis might look at this question versus how American Jews would look at this question. And the same debate was happening amongst the Babylonians and the Eretz Israeli Jews, the Jews from the land of Israel. Yeah, Erwin. You're muted.
I'm sorry. The light bulb just went off. We're talking about the disgrace of being slaves, yet as you go through the Torah, the Jews had slaves. There are rules for how to release them after so many years of service, and what to do if they want to stay with you. You pierce their ear. So why do we consider it such a disgrace to be a slave when we had slaves?
Well, I mean, you're just pointing out even more support maybe for Rav, which is that's not really what the disgrace is all about. The disgrace is really about not being in the land of Israel, or perhaps it's about worshiping idols. But maybe the story is not so much about slavery. at least from the biblical perspective, because as you point out, slavery was a fact of life for even the Israelites. But we, modern people look at slavery as the main issue, but maybe maybe it wasn't always. Maybe the issue was the destination that they were going to after leaving Egypt was the land of Israel. It's really a fascinating question, and it speaks to the power of the Haggadah, that it's constantly being reinterpreted. Just as the Babylonian Jews reinterpreted Rav to say it's not about land of Israel, it's about idolatry or about slavery. And we constantly are reinterpreting the Haggadah to be meaningful for us. And that's really the whole point of what the Haggadah is supposed to do. We're supposed to tell the story as if we ourselves were living in the land of Egypt and we're saved. So I had these two questions here. The Talmud doesn't tell, it tells us what the disgrace is, but it doesn't tell us what the praise is. I've often thought of the answer to that question of what is the praise comes in the structure of the Haggadah itself, that when we get to the part where we're free from the land of Egypt, we sing hallelujah, we sing the Hallel, we praise God, and that's the praise. We lift our glass and we say it's our obligation to thank and praise and glorify God. And I always thought that that's the praise, but actually it may be that the praise is embedded in the verses that these two rabbis are saying that we should read. So if you go back and you look at Avadim Hayinu, within the very verse that's quoted, there's praise. So the disgraces, we were slaves to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. And the praise could be, and the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That right there is the praise. And it could be that they knew that what the end of the verse was, you didn't need to tell anyone what the praise was. It's there right in the end of the verse. And then the same thing with the verse that's chosen here. Over the river our ancestors dwelled from always. That's the disgrace. But the praise comes, this might be the next verse, but it's right after that. And I took your father Abraham from over the river, and I made him walk in all the land of Canaan, and I increased his seed, and I gave him Yitzchak. So the praise is getting the land of Israel, whereas before the praise was being taken out of slavery and taken out of Egypt. And here the praise is arriving to the land of Israel. So again, depending on what your disgrace is, your praise might be different. But whatever it is, I think it should be relevant to our own experience today.
Rabbi, another question about our experience today. Obviously, as we talk, we're looking at this with contemporary eyes of something that was written in a very different time. You were speaking about the slaves were a fact of the world at that time. In a sense, is the bigger disgrace not so much the slavery, but the treatment of the slaves? Would Moses have been better not being an abolitionist, but being a union organizer, so to speak?
Right. Certainly the Torah says, if you do have slaves, you have to treat them well. You have to treat them right. And so that absolutely is a possibility, that it's not the institution of slavery that's a problem, but it's the way that slavery is implemented. Absolutely. And you can find, I think in New Jersey, there is a labor Seder every year. So, as I said, people are constantly making the Seder relevant to them, to whatever your experience might be. So let's look at the next section here, which is the 4 sons, or the 4 children, another very popular part of the Haggadah. So would somebody like to read here the 4 sons?
Pesach Haggadah. Oh, somebody gonna read?
No, go ahead.
You go ahead.
4 sons. What does the wise son say? What are these testimonies, statutes, and judgments that the Lord our God commanded you? Deuteronomy. And according to you, accordingly, you will say to him, as per the laws of the Pesach sacrifice, we may not eat an afikomen, the dessert of the food of the meal, after we are finished eating the Pesach sacrifice, Mishnah Hasham, whatever.
Right. Psachim.
Pashachim. Okay, chim. What does evil son say? What is the worship to you? To you, not to him, since he has excluded himself from the collective. He denied the principle of the Jewish faith, and accordingly, he will blunt his teeth and say, for the sake of this, did the Lord do this for me, and in my going out of Egypt, and for me, and not for him, as if he had been there, he would not have been enslaved. Big shot.
No, he would not have been saved.
Oh, saved, right. But I mean, still, he was,
Right.
No, don't talk for me. We used to say, because there were 4 sisters, we used to say, what do the 4 sisters say? Which is a modern feminist spin on this, but we never said the 4 sons. We always had the 4 sisters.
Well, because you had the 4 daughters in your
Right, exactly. But I'm saying,
Right.
so it kind
And
of.
I'm
also
sure
could be spin.
I'm sure each one of you had opinion on who was the wise and who was the wicked, right? So the question here is, which I have here, why is the wicked child punished for saying that this Passover is for you, when that's exactly what the wise son said?
Because he's
So-
wicked.
Yeah, but the wicked son says, what is this worship to you and not to me?
He's
Right.
self-absorbed.
But that's exactly what the wise son says. What are these testimonies, statutes, judgments that the Lord your God commanded to you?
But he's saying it nicely.
So it's how he says it?
It's how he says it, of course.
Okay, that's one answer.
You don't have any fights with your brothers? No.
Never.
You don't.
But-
You don't have the wise, the wicked, the dumb, and the stupid in your
Right,
family,
well,
huh?
Well, there were only 2 sons.
I know, I'd say.
But so you're saying it's how you say it.
Yes, that's
but-
how, not what you
but
say,
the
but how
written
you say
text-
it.
But the written text, doesn't give us any inflection. So.
Well, I'm getting given
What if
flexion.
What if it's just the stupidity and asking the same question again?
I
Like
like that.
that is the problem with it.
Wait a
That
minute.
somebody just said it.
Right.
Someone, the wise son said the testimony, the statutes, and the judgments.
Right.
And the evil son said the worship. Those are different things. They both use the you, but one is the worshiping and the other one is, what are the statutes? What are the testimonies? Tell me. And the other one says, what is this worship to you?
Right. Yeah. No, definitely. Although we should point out that the wicked son, the reply to him is that it's, lachem v'lo lo. It's to you and not to him. So they're specifically saying that the problem was not about worship per se, but it was about the fact that he's saying, this is for you, it's not for me. This is your stuff, guys. This is not ours. This is not mine.
It always seemed to me that the person writing the dialogue did not do such a great job. It's clear that the important part of this part of the Haggadah is the sentence to you and not to him. And since he excluded himself from the collective, this was clearly the intent of the passage. And the guy writing the dialogue sort of fell down on the job.
Well, I like how that you say that. So it may not have been that he fell down on the job. So there is a really interesting answer that's kind of a simple one, not as creative as the answers that you all gave, which are the more creative one and interesting, and kind of this is what the Haggadah is all about, is trying to figure out, make it relevant to you, whether you have 4 sisters or 4 brothers, and try and really figure out what's going on here. But there may be actually a simple explanation, which is that this is a question of what's the correct version of the text. So what we have here is a quote from Deuteronomy, when the wise son says, "What are these testimonies, statutes, and judgments that the Lord our God commanded you?" Now, we should point out that he does say "our God" here, but that he says "commanded you." So this is the Hebrew text that you would find in a Torah scroll, or any Chumash that you might have. It says that Asher Tziva Adonai Eloheinu etchem, that our God commanded you. This is what our Torahs have. But if you actually look at the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation, but a Jewish Greek translation, translated by the Jewish community in Alexandria in Egypt, but the Jewish community there, which spoke Greek, it's an ancient translation. It actually has, "Then if your son should ever ask you, what are the words, rules, and decisions that Jehovah," this is how they translate it, I just gave you the exact translation, "our God has given to us." So if you're using the Septuagint's translation, then the wise son doesn't say that our God commanded to you. He says that our God commanded to us, and is including himself in these laws. And so then this makes much more sense that the evil son, the Rasha, the wicked son, is specifically saying to you and not to us. But the wise son doesn't. The wise son says, includes himself. So there was no need to comment about it. So we don't have a Hebrew version that has us, but we do have a very ancient Greek source that does have it. So I brought the Greek in case there's anyone who reads ancient Greek. I do not. So I can't tell you which one of these words is us here, but so I apologize. But so and what's interesting also is that we have ancient Haggadahs that actually have us, not you. So this is a case where actually our contemporary Haggadahs may have recorrected the ancient Haggadahs to read the version of the Torah that we have, because it didn't match the version of the Torah we had. But in ancient Haggadot, they kept in what may have been the correct version of the Torah. I mean, it's hard to say, but may have had the same version that the Septuagint has. So that's a very simple reason, not as creative and maybe as interesting as the ones that were proposed. But the other thing that's kind of interesting about the 4 sons is that the Jerusalem Talmud, again, another version, doesn't have it does not speak of the simple child. So we all know about we have the wise, the wicked, the simple, and the one who doesn't know how to ask. The Jerusalem Talmud is a bit more blunt and says there's a wise son, an evil son, a stupid son, and a son who doesn't know how to ask. So ben tipesh. This is probably a case of the Haggadah trying to use more refined language and not saying he's not stupid, he's simple. So I kind of like that idea that the Talmud, that the Haggadah said, this may not go over so well. So when editors of the Haggadah were putting together, they said, let's soften this a bit and say he's simple. And then finally here, something again interesting in the Jerusalem Talmud, we have the answers to the questions. So the wise son says, what are the laws, the testimony, statutes, judgments that God's commanding us? The answer to him, though, in the Jerusalem Talmud is, and accordingly you will say to him, with the strength of his hand did the Lord take us out of Egypt from the house of slaves. You'll notice this is not the answer that's given in our Haggadah. The answer is he asked about the halachot, he asked about the laws. And so you answer him with laws. You tell him about the Passover sacrifice, the afikomen. But here it's giving a kind of a narrative answer, that the laws are there because God brought us out of Egypt. Now the stupid son, or the simple son, we would understand, but the Jerusalem Talmud calls him stupid. He says, what is this? Mazot. And then the answer to him is, and you accordingly will teach him the laws of Pesach, sacrifice, that we may not eat of the afikomen after the Pesach sacrifice, so the person should not get up from one eating group to another eating group. So the stupid son in the Jerusalem Talmud is answered with laws. He gets this is the wise son's answer in the Passover Haggadah about the laws of the Passover sacrifice and the afikomen. So it's possible that the Jerusalem Talmud, this may have been a mistake by the copyist, by the editor, and flipped them around, but maybe there's a reason. Maybe there is a more meaningful answer here for why in the Haggadah those are switched up. The wise child is answered with Jewish law, but in the Jerusalem Talmud, the wise child is answered with a story. So my question to you is, which is the more appropriate for which child? Erwin, do you have a thought?
No, I had a different question. I
Okay,
can wait
go ahead.
until you finish this.
Well, no, ask your question. We can answer both.
Well, looking at this actually brings me back to last week's discussion. You have the child who's either stupid or simple, and the one who has no capacity to ask, which really seem like minimally different descriptions of the same child. As with the 4 questions, which we said were 3, I've also heard it explained again that, with the advent of Christianity, it was a way of making a 4th question or a 4th child, so we didn't have 3 anymore. Perhaps I'm forgetful, but I do recall when several people mentioned that thought last week, you indicated you hadn't heard,
Right.
which is fine. We're all here to learn. I'm just curious. I don't recall you saying what your reason or understanding of why we added the 4th question.
Well, the 4th question, so the explanation that I gave for the addition of the 4th question was because it made it makes sense later in Jewish history when Jews were eating the way most closer to the way we eat, where we eat, sitting at a chair and not reclining, and so that would have prompted the children to ask a question. So
you feel there was a custom that came later, and therefore, as the custom came later, the question was added to reflect the more recent custom.
Well, not that the custom of leaning was an ancient custom, but it wouldn't, back in ancient times, everyone, at all meals, they would have reclined. That's the way
I understand.
Right.
You're describing it as a more recent custom in terms of reenacting what was done.
Well, just know that in the Middle Ages, they wouldn't have, the children would have said, wait, why are we reclining? That's weird. And that's a good question to ask to prompt discussion. Whereas in ancient times, that question wouldn't have made any sense. So it's not that there was no new custom of leaning in the Seder. It's just that the newness of, or the uniqueness of it only became plain later on, which required a new question to be asked. But of course, there's no reason why that fourth question had to be added. You're absolutely right. So if we're thinking about the symbolism of it, sure, absolutely, that it could have been that we needed to add a fourth question to not have a number 3, which would have been too much close to the importance of the number 3 for Christianity. That absolutely is possible. And I think sounds like where you're going is maybe we added a 4th son because also we didn't want to have 3 sons, which would have been adding too much number 3 symbolism again for Christianity.
Exactly.
Right. It's possible, I have not looked at the history of it, but it certainly is reasonable.
Is it possible that it goes the other way, that we had the 4 sons, so we figured that we should add another question?
I was gonna say that too. That's also possible that because there were 4 sons, then we said, well, if there's 4 sons, there should be 4 questions, 1 for each son, and there's the symmetry there. So that's possible too. Which do you have a thought about? Does anyone have a thought about this? Which answer is more appropriate for which child? Should law be given to the wise child or the stupid child, or should stories be given to the wise child or to the stupid child?
Well, the wise child, so that they'll be part of the continuum and keep telling that story, because only through stories do we know and hear. So the stupid one might have learning disabilities and not be able to project, but the wise child might be able to pass it along.
Yeah, well, I like that idea that it's not a given to say that that wisdom is about law. We kind of have certain biases in the Jewish tradition to say, well, the smartest of us, are the rabbis, of course, who love and what they care about is law, right? Jewish law. So that, of course, we put that at the top of the hierarchy, and sometimes at the expense of the story that we're telling as a people. But it may be actually for somebody who, as Lynn says, I love that you bring in the idea of learning disabilities, somebody for whom maybe narrative and story is very difficult. Literature might be difficult for them, but law is very logical, it's mathematical, it's easier for them to grasp as somebody maybe who has a reading disability will latch on more to laws and what am I supposed to do, and give me the X, Y, and Z and the ABC that I can follow, and that might be a more appropriate answer for them. So I think that perhaps one of the lessons here from the Yerushalmi and the comparison between the Yerushalmi and the Haggadah, and the fact that the answers are sometimes jumbled up and switched, is that any answer could possibly work for any child that you're speaking to. There's no one answer that works for every person, even within categories, to say, well, this is the wise child, and so they have to have this answer. Well, no, the wise child, it might be more, we might agree that they're wise, but we might say that it's more appropriate to answer them with law, or this other wise child might be more appropriate to answer them with the story. I think we have to be really deep in thinking of the appropriateness of the way that we tell the story, which the 4 sons section that's what it's all about, is telling the story in an appropriate way for the person that's listening. But it goes even deeper than perhaps what the 4 children is about, that even within the categories, there are lots of different ways to answer the question. And there are lots of different ways to tell the story. So I will stop there, and next week we'll continue on, look at more of the Haggadah and more of the telling of the story and other ways that it's told. I hope this was helpful, and I hope that it defamiliarized us with the Haggadah, but in a way that helps us to understand it a little bit more.
Boy, am I going to ask you a lot of questions at Seder.
There you go. Well, then I'm gonna have to think
I'm
about.
going to be very knowledgeable at Seder. I'll
That's
have
right.
some of the answers, right?
Right. Well, or you'll have better questions. It's not always about the answers. It's about the
That's right. It's about the questions. That's right.
Right.
She'll be the wise child.
No. That'll be one of my grandkids. They're always the wise child. They have another hierarchy.
So thank you everyone for
Thank you.
joining
Lovely.
us.
Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Very informative.
good. Once
Thank you.
more.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Lovely. Lovely.
Thank you.